I never chased attention. I didn't speak in meetings to prove I belonged. I let the work speak, and for a long time, that was enough. I built my place in the company by becoming the quiet thread woven through every major product launch. Never in the spotlight, but always present in the foundation. My reports weren't colorful, they were precise. Behavioral segmentation, pricing sensitivity, early adoption modeling. I had spent a decade making the company's decisions safer, sharper, and more honest. My research had once influenced timelines, halted misguided expansions, saved departments from doubling down on bad instincts. I was trusted, even if I wasn't quoted. But all of that changed when the executive team turned over. A new CEO, a new chief product officer, a fresh VP of strategy, flown in from a failed startup with enough charm to rewrite the past. They came in with buzzwords and urgency. Efficiency, speed, alignment. There was no time to explain why things were done a certain way. Everything was a legacy issue. Everything had to be simplified, modernized, rebuilt. At first, I watched quietly, assuming the structure would settle. Then I noticed my calendar shifting, slowly but unmistakably. The first meeting I was cut from was the Monday market positioning call. Then the Thursday product readiness sync. Then the cross-functional roadmap review I had helped design 3 years prior. When I asked, I was told, always politely, that we were trimming meetings for efficiency, that my reports could be sent in advance, that I was empowered to own insight without being tied to real-time decision loops. I understood what that meant. I was being extracted from the process. They didn't want pushback. They wanted performance, not critical thought, confirmation bias packaged in bullet points, and I was too thorough, too careful, too unshiny for that. They didn't say it directly. They didn't have to. The silence was structured. I adapted. I began sending brief summaries to match the tone. One-pagers, color-coded, chart-heavy. No footnotes, no methodology. They praised the format. Much easier to skim. Exactly what we need to move fast. But I couldn't bring myself to stop thinking. So I created 2 versions of every report. One they asked for and one that told the full truth. The truth never made it into meetings. But I archived it anyway, and in doing so, I unknowingly prepared for what was coming. Because you can remove someone from the conversation, but not from the consequence of ignoring them. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The process of being erased is rarely dramatic. It's procedural. One decision at a time, one exclusion at a time, one reply all chain you're not included in. I started noticing that my name had disappeared from document footers, even though the research was mine. Slides I had prepared were repurposed by other departments with no reference, no credit. Junior staff began referencing the data we got from strategy without realizing the source was me. I wasn't offended. I was watching. I still showed up. I still sent the reports. But each version I submitted was shorter, more diluted. That was what they wanted. Less thinking, more packaging. So I gave them what they asked for, and quietly, I kept the originals. Deep dives, side notes, margin flags. Not because I wanted proof, but because I refused to become a version of myself that only existed in summary. They hadn't just cut me out of meetings, they had cut the work off from its own depth. Meanwhile, I began to see decisions unravel in slow motion. The new VP of product pushed a launch timeline forward based on momentum. No one asked about the market saturation forecast I had prepared because they hadn't seen it. They'd only received the clean version with 3 graphs and no context. When I gently flagged concerns to a manager, I was told, "Noted, but the execs are aligned on the push." That sentence echoed in my mind. Noted, but ignored. It became clear. This was a system built to move too fast to hear itself think, and I was never going to be loud enough to stop it. But I didn't leave. I didn't escalate. I didn't write long justifications or demand to be re-included. I kept the rhythm. I built the documents, I matched their tone, and all the while, I saved the real work, version after version, neatly dated, meticulously backed, quietly filed. I began to see this not as defeat, but as preparation. Because I knew systems like this. I had seen what happens when leadership confuses visibility with clarity. When executives start chasing outcomes but discard the inputs that make outcomes possible. They always crash. And when they do, they scramble for the last person who still knows how to read the map. I wasn't waiting to be vindicated. I was waiting for what I knew was inevitable. The moment when the surface would crack and all the things they had discarded would start to matter again. Not because I demanded they listen, but because they could no longer afford not to. I stopped thinking about meetings as the place where real work happened. The invitations had dried up months ago, replaced by cold calendar removals and polite deferrals. But the work, the actual thinking, the synthesis, the risk modeling, still needed to be done. And I still did it. Every product launch, every market shift, every campaign pivot, I prepared full reports. Not because they asked for them, because I knew what would happen if no one did. I had seen the trajectory. I'd watched how fast the company had moved from thoughtful strategy to executive instinct. The new leadership team believed decisiveness equaled insight. But there is a difference between speed and precision. And while they rode momentum, I tracked details. Quietly, privately, precisely. I created a separate archive on my drive. Every version of every stripped-down report I submitted had a counterpart. The full version I wasn't allowed to present. I logged every client behavior shift, flagged every misalignment between marketing promise and product delivery. I tracked competitor launches that mirrored our own ideas. Ideas I had flagged as saturated and late to market, but that had been greenlit anyway because they felt right. No one saw these reports, but I wrote them anyway. I wasn't building a case, I was building clarity. Outside the executive tier, a few colleagues noticed. They'd ping me with soft questions. Hey, did we ever check regional sentiment before we pitched that messaging line? Or, was there a reason we avoided that product name last time? I answered when I could, without drawing attention. Most of them had learned, like I had, that curiosity was no longer safe. Still, the gaps were starting to show. Deliverables missed context. Forecasts changed mid-quarter without explanation. Executives blamed unpredictable consumer behavior. But there's nothing unpredictable about patterns when you know where to look. They just weren't looking anymore. The culture had shifted into full performance mode. Everyone smiled in meetings, everyone nodded along, and everything looked fine. Until it wasn't. And when it wasn't, people looked for someone to blame. But I wasn't interested in blame. I was interested in patterns. Because systems like this don't fail from sabotage. They fail from assumption. And the biggest assumption they made was that by excluding me from the table, they had also removed the need for the kind of work I do. So I did it anyway. Not for recognition, for readiness, because I knew eventually someone would ask, did anyone flag this? And when they did, I wanted the answer to be simple. Yes, I did. You just didn't read it. There's a freedom that comes when no one's watching. A certain invisibility that, when you stop resisting it, becomes a vantage point. They had sidelined me from the decision-making circle, convinced that exclusion was the same as irrelevance. But I understood something they didn't. Distance doesn't dissolve insight. It sharpens it. Without the noise of executive urgency, I had space to track what they had stopped noticing. I started building timelines, not for performance, but for patterns. I aligned product launches with market shifts, overlaid sentiment trends with feature changes, and mapped internal timelines against consumer behavior cycles. Every time I submitted a simplified chart, I attached the full report in a quiet subfolder. No one asked for it, but I kept going. Because I wasn't waiting for permission, I was building a record of what could have been seen. The cracks were growing. One product launch landed flat, despite high engagement in pre-launch campaigns. Internally, they blamed poor timing. But I had flagged the timing 4 weeks earlier. Consumer burnout in that segment had peaked, and our messaging hadn't adapted. Another initiative was delayed after a compliance concern surfaced, one I had documented as a risk in a buried appendix no one had opened. I didn't say, I told you so. I didn't say anything. I just kept writing. Meanwhile, people started circling back. Not leadership, but those in the middle, the ones carrying out directives, trying to hit impossible metrics with incomplete context. They started asking where the old insights had gone, why reports were shorter, why forecasting felt off. One senior designer pulled me aside after a review and said, I miss your footnotes. I didn't always understand them, but they made me pause. That sentence stayed with me because pausing had become the thing no one did anymore. Leadership still operated on confidence. Weekly meetings were rehearsed performances of certainty, but beneath it, you could feel the undercurrent of unease. Projects were stacking up behind deadlines. KPIs were being redefined mid-quarter. Teams were quietly burning out, chasing objectives built on assumptions. And still, no one looked back. No one asked what had been missed. I didn't push. I didn't offer to rejoin meetings. I didn't nudge anyone toward my work. But I kept it there, intact, time-stamped, and unspoken, because I knew what they didn't. Systems that ignore depth eventually trip on their own surface. And when that moment came, they wouldn't need my voice. They'd need my archive. The moment it began to break wasn't loud. It was a typo. A small one, buried in the footnote of a Q2 product release deck, an incorrect reference to a consumer priority that had shifted 6 months earlier. On its own, it was easy to miss. But that footnote became a trigger, because the claim, centered on cost sensitivity in a segment that had recently moved toward value-based preferences, wasn't just off, it was backward. And when the product underperformed, the confusion surfaced fast. The marketing team blamed research. The research team blamed timing. The VP of strategy pointed to shifting consumer sentiment, though nothing in our data justified the direction they'd taken. Internally, the narrative formed. We just missed it. But that wasn't true. I hadn't missed it. I had flagged it in the version they never read. What followed wasn't chaos. It was silence. No one knew quite what to say. The CEO had backed the campaign personally. Investors had been looped in. Forecasts were missed. Press was lukewarm. Then, during a high-level email exchange, someone asked the question everyone had avoided. Was this in the original risk review? And that was when it happened. A message from the CEO, hastily forwarded from his phone, meant for a single executive, landed in the full leadership thread. It was short. See Calderon's full document. It's in there. Attached to the email was a file, my report. The real one, not the one-pager, not the summary deck. The full, annotated document I had written 3 months earlier, complete with a section labeled Emerging Reversal in Consumer Priorities, and a red box around the very insight that could have redirected the entire launch. My name was on the cover page. My analysis was in the margins. My signature formatting ran down each section. It wasn't just a data point. It was a mirror, and now they had all seen it. There was no reply all scramble, no immediate fallout, just a collective pause, the kind that happens when everyone realizes they've ignored the only person who had seen it coming. And the worst part wasn't that they missed it, it was that they had asked for less. They had demanded silence disguised as efficiency, and I had given it to them, but not fully, because I had known this day would come. And now it had arrived, wrapped in their own oversight, delivered by their own leader, traced back to the work they thought they didn't need. After the email went out, no one spoke to me for 3 days. Not because they were angry, because they didn't know how to explain what had just happened. The full version of my report, ignored, abbreviated, filtered, had been circulated. Not by me, but by the CEO himself. He hadn't meant to forward it widely. That much was obvious. It was a mistake. But in that mistake, something ruptured. Quietly, permanently, because the document didn't just contain facts, it contained a timeline of everything they had refused to hear. Each page was a reflection. Forecasts, consumer psychology shifts, geographic differentials, all flagged with clarity, method, caution. In my own annotations, I had outlined 3 major risks. One of them was the exact factor that derailed the launch. There was no ambiguity, and now there was no plausible denial. The leadership team had made decisions that ignored the one resource they had systematically excluded. Not because they lacked data, but because they didn't like how it sounded when the data asked them to slow down. I didn't ask for a meeting. I didn't send a follow-up. I had no interest in gloating, no desire to frame it as revenge. What would have been the point? They already knew. One by one, I began to notice the shift. My name, once absent from calendars and planning threads, began to reappear. I was looped back into syncs that I'd been cut from months before. An invite to the quarterly roadmap review landed in my inbox, this time with a note, "Would love your input on the next phase." But I said nothing. I joined, I listened, I delivered my portion, nothing more. Because they weren't asking me to return, they were asking to undo what they'd erased. And some things don't reverse easily, especially credibility, especially when the people who removed you now needed your insight not as input, but as insulation. Internally, people began treating me differently. The mid-level managers who once skimmed past my reports now asked follow-up questions. The new hires who had never heard me speak before suddenly leaned in when I did. Not because I had become more vocal, but because the silence they had trusted had failed them. And mine now carried weight. The VP of strategy, once the loudest in the room, stopped scheduling tight-turn brainstorms. He started quoting data again, cautiously. I recognized the phrasing. It was mine. But what struck me most was the way other analysts responded. Some of them started writing longer reports again. Some stopped apologizing for including caveats in their findings. One sent me a message after seeing my full report. "Thank you for proving there's still a place for depth." I didn't prove anything. I had only kept doing the work they thought was unnecessary. The mistake wasn't in their speed. It was in their certainty. They built a culture that dismissed quiet accuracy for fast alignment. And that culture had failed in the most predictable way. It ignored the one person who had never stopped watching. The unraveling became too visible to contain. There were no more clever slides, no rebranded KPIs to hide behind. Revenue from the latest launch flatlined after the first quarter, well below projections. Refunds increased, support tickets spiked, and for the first time since the executive team had arrived, the word mistake was used in public, in a company-wide meeting no less. They didn't name names, but they didn't need to. Everyone knew where the failure had landed, and everyone now knew who had predicted it. Behind the scenes, damage control took over. The VP of product was pulled into private sessions with legal and finance. The marketing team issued 2 separate statements to distributors, vaguely referencing temporary recalibrations in alignment. Meanwhile, a new product slated for launch was put on indefinite hold. No formal announcement, just a delay that stretched into silence. And beneath it all, the real loss took shape. Confidence. Not investor confidence. Internal confidence. The kind you can't quantify but feel in every meeting where people speak less, email more, and start hedging even simple opinions. I saw the shift in how decisions were made, or weren't. Projects slowed down. Syncs turned into status reads. The bravado that had filled rooms just months earlier faded into cautious language and silent deferrals. Leaders stopped pretending they were leading. They started looking for someone to clean up the architecture they had dismantled. And that's when my work started showing up again. It began quietly. One project manager asked if they could review previous report iterations I had written. Another requested access to archived segmentation data just to double-check baselines. Then, someone from finance asked for context on a trend line they'd never seen before, because it had only been in the full version of the report I kept for myself. They had started circling back to the depth they'd once removed, and that depth still lived in the files they hadn't deleted, because I had never stopped building them. But something else was collapsing too. The illusion that had protected leadership, the narrative that the future belonged to the boldest, the fastest, the loudest. That myth had cost the company not just credibility, but market share. They hadn't just made a bad decision, they had systematized blindness, and now they were staring at its cost. For the first time in over a year, the CEO sent me a direct message. It was short. It only said, "I've been reading your original reports. Would you have time to walk me through the market confidence piece you flagged last year?" I stared at the message for a long time, not because it surprised me, but because I knew exactly what it meant. The collapse had arrived, and now they were looking for the person they had tried to erase. Not because they valued me again, but because they needed to understand how they'd fallen so far without seeing it. The meeting with the CEO happened late on a Thursday. No camera, no agenda, just a quiet voice asking questions he should have asked a year earlier. He didn't defend his team. He didn't try to reframe the failure. He just listened, really listened. I walked him through the original market segmentation, the early signals of consumer fatigue, the tone mismatch between campaign messaging and behavioral data. I showed him the delta between what I had submitted and what had been distilled by layers of presentation logic. At one point he said, "Why didn't we see this?" I didn't answer. He already knew. After that meeting, things shifted, quickly, not with announcements or applause, but with acknowledgments. The team that once trimmed my insights down into bite-sized bullet points now asked for full reports. The people who had removed me from meetings quietly added me back to threads. One day I received a calendar invite titled Strategic Forecasting Alignment, led by Lena Calderon. No one mentioned it aloud, but it was there, and so was I. The VP of product resigned shortly after. The internal memo praised his vision, but no one said a word in the hallway. His departure wasn't a scandal, it was gravity. And gravity, once set in motion, doesn't ask permission. The fast lane culture collapsed under its own pressure. The teams that had been pushed to simplify everything now begged for deeper context. Leaders who had once framed analysis as slowing things down now wanted nuance, urgently, daily. But nuance doesn't arrive on demand, it's built through discipline. And discipline doesn't survive in systems that cut it out for the sake of speed. I didn't rush to take back space. I let them come to me. And they did, more of them each week. One by one, they began to ask how we could build systems that were sustainable, predictive, grounded. They weren't looking for a hero, they were looking for clarity. And clarity had always been the one thing I'd protected, even when no one asked me to. The collapse wasn't a moment, it was a series of recognitions. That the loudest voice isn't always the wisest. That speed without structure is just a countdown to error. And that erasing someone from the room doesn't erase the work they've done, or the cost of ignoring it. They had excluded me for efficiency. But now they had learned what they thought was efficient was actually fragile. And the only thing still standing was the work they didn't want until they needed it most. I didn't ask to lead. I had stopped expecting that a long time ago. But when they offered it, not as a gesture, but as a necessity, I didn't hesitate. The role wasn't flashy. It came without announcement, without ceremony, just a quiet message from the chief of staff. We'd like you to design the new Insights workflow top to bottom. No directives, no guardrails, just trust. Real trust. The kind that only arrives after a system has broken down enough to realize what it lost. I accepted, not because I wanted to restore the past, but because I knew how to build a future that didn't erase people like me. The first thing I did was slow everything down, not to stall, but to reintroduce rhythm. I called in the analysts, the ones who had learned to stay quiet, learned to make things small, learned that curiosity had a cost. I asked them what they wished they could say. I asked what they had stopped submitting, what they had stopped building because they knew no one would read it. Their answers were careful at first, but then they expanded into blueprints, frameworks, new methodologies. Not because they suddenly had permission, but because someone finally asked with the intention to listen. That was the difference. I worked with product and marketing leadership to integrate insights from day one, not post-decision, not to validate, but to inform. I wrote protocols for protecting long-form analysis alongside executive briefs. I designed a two-tiered system, fast summaries for agility, full reports for depth. Both were required. Neither stood alone. People called it innovative. It wasn't. It was memory, formalized. The memory of what happens when you cut the wrong voice from the room and call it optimization. The culture began to shift, slowly, carefully. Executives started sitting in on analyst reviews again, not to skim, but to ask questions. We set a rule, no summary without source. If someone wanted to quote a stat, they had to know where it came from. If they didn't use it. That single rule rewired how information moved through the company. I wasn't performing authority, I was reestablishing integrity. My reports didn't look different, but the room did. And the silence that once surrounded my work had turned into something else entirely. Attention. I never raised my voice, I never fought for credit, I never made a scene, but my work outlasted every shortcut, every empty meeting, every voice that once spoke over mine. The systems I rebuilt weren't loud, they were reliable. They didn't impress in slides, they held up under pressure. And over time, people began to understand the difference. Teams stopped measuring output by volume and started asking better questions. When data didn't support a decision, the decision waited. When nuance surfaced, it wasn't trimmed, it was explored. And the people who once stayed quiet now contributed without fear of being edited into irrelevance. The CEO never apologized, but he did something better. He began sending my reports directly to the board. Not summaries, not recaps, full versions. And he began referencing them by name, my name, not for recognition, for accountability. The culture that once believed speed was strategy had evolved into something steadier, not slower, smarter, more deliberate, and at the center of it wasn't a person. It was a standard, a model of how truth moves through organizations when allowed to stay whole. I trained new hires differently. I didn't teach them how to get noticed. I taught them how to be thorough when no one's watching, how to write for clarity, not for praise, how to document assumptions, how to build models for people who may never thank them, but will one day need them. I built a system that didn't rely on personality to protect insight. It relied on structure, and that structure bore my imprint. I never went back to chasing titles. I didn't need to, because the work spoke in every meeting, in every course correction that now happened early, not too late, in every executive who paused before speaking and asked, "What's the insight behind that?" That pause, small, subtle, silent, is my legacy. I wasn't the loudest, I wasn't the fastest, but I was right. And in the end, that was the one thing they could no longer afford to ignore.